So we're back then with something a bit different from Marvel's Avengers. We had a blog post today which was showcasing 4 different Black Panther developer builds. Now in this blog post it states there's some pro tips from the developers and how you actually want to build Black Panther. So what I'm going to do, I'm a build guy, that's what I really enjoy looking at and doing. So I'm going to look at the 4 different builds that are available and I'm going to rate them, or if it's appropriate I'm going to actually roast them depending on how they actually are. Now we've got 2 different scoring methods for these. The first one, if the build is bad, will be this.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
If we have a good build here, and the reason I'm putting this clip at the beginning is I'm not that confident that I'll actually be using this clip, but if we do get a good build then we'll be rating it via this.
Pretty good.
So let's dive in and break these builds down. The first one we have is from Hannah Ballard and she is a QA supervisor. So with each of these builds here, they're actually split up over several pages, but at the end of each of them, rather usefully, we have a TLDR that runs over the key points of them. But some of the information in this first page, because I'm not going to read it all out, this is a range Black Panther build. It's making use of the Vibranium status effect that will be on the daggers he's thrown. You've got Vibranium payload, which will come via slots 2 and 4. You have a perk on slot number 1 they mention. Dagger Magnifier, a perk that increases status damage from dagger attacks by 15%, and then they also mention the fact that to get their precision to go through the roof, as they state, they're using 2 blue ISO 8s as well. The precision, you can see it's 2300, that's definitely on the lower side. I wouldn't call that through the roof at all, but that's the first page. Let's jump on to the next one. So with this section here we have 2 key parts. The top one is talking about masteries, the next one is talking about the major artifact, which is the Kimoyo band. So that's a quick summary of the build. Now we can get into the TLDR and I'll actually break it all down. There is a lot that's wrong with this build. Now builds don't have to be perfect, but if you're putting out a blog post saying here's some pro tips, you want to be offering some pro tips. So if we look at the slot 1 first, you get Dagger Magnifier perk on melee gear slot. So that I believe will be classed as Wakandan gear, which means it can only roll might. You can't actually get precision rolling on it, so you're missing out with some precision stats there for your range build. Also with Dagger Magnifier, recently in game they changed the likes of Tacticon, Surge and so on, so when it says it does status damage, it doesn't. It actually just does status build up instead. So as far as I'm aware, you won't be getting 15% additional status damage from this, you'll just be getting 15% additional status build up. For the next line here, it says slots 2 and 3 is Vibranium payload, perk on ranged and heroic gear slots. I believe that should say 2 and 4 because heroic is slot number 4, not slot number 3. Slot number 3 is your defensive gear. You don't need Vibranium payload on both of these. It's overkill, it's a nice perk, but you do not need it on both of them. What you'd be looking for on your slot number 2 is your damage buff on range crit instead. That would give you 35% crit and 60% damage multiplier. The next line says slot 4, I believe it should actually say slot 2, so we're not doing too good here. This is Kinetic Reverberation perk. This is the one that gives you the Vibranium status on your daggers. You don't want to go for a warm status effect on your daggers if you're doing a range build. With Black Panther, he has a setup he can use where he throws out his spear and it will instantly apply full Vibranium. Vibranium is a warm status effect, so what you want to do is you want to lead a fight by throwing out your spear to apply your warm status effect, and then you want to follow up with a cold status effect on your daggers. So you would go, for example, Cryo, you would go for Sonic, something along the lines of that. That gives you your battery damage and that will double your damage. So with this setup here, you're not using the damage buff, you're not using the battery at all. It's just not good at all. Looking at the minor artifacts, you've got your high precision. It's kind of a no-brainer that you actually go for these, but I'll mention that when we've seen the stats a moment ago, 2300 is still definitely on the lower side when you're using double blue ISOs here. The major artifact's another one that I wouldn't go for. It's the Kimoyo band major artifact. When we look at it, it actually looks like it's really good. You've got that additional 30% status damage. This is the same as one of the perks we talked about earlier on. It doesn't add damage to status attacks, it only adds build up, so you're actually getting 0 damage from this. You've then got the Okoye summon. She's not the best of summons, I much prefer Hank Pym. I find that she gets staggered very often and she won't instantly apply the the Vibranium status effect the same way Hank Pym instantly applies Pym, and that's even to bosses. So if I was to fix this build, what I would go for is damage buff on slot number 2 or potentially slot number 4, which would be on enemy defeat. You want to use the Tacticon as a major artifact as you're using status effects on your ranged, and you want to use a cold status effect on your daggers rather than a warm one, so you can get the battery effect there. So overall, how would I rate this build?
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
So we're definitely not off to a good start with the builds here. The next one we have is from Alex Kendi. I believe he's the guy that's in charge of the loot, and he's in charge of the upcoming loot for the Wakanda raid, so fingers crossed he's actually got an idea of how to build a character. Let's have a look and let's find out. So this build here, the actual layout on the blog post is a little bit confusing, so do bear with me as we go through it. I'm going to have to bring up some of my infographics as well, so it makes more sense for you. But with this here, the whole kit is based around stacking debuffs and targets while keeping percussive blast up and doing cool intrinsic attacks. One thing I would say, if you're looking to spam percussive blast, you don't want to be doing intrinsic attacks because they'll drain your intrinsic meter, meaning you can't actually spam your percussive blast. That's just one thing to bear in mind there. Next up, it's stating the first 2 items are keys to that. So you've got Battle Guard, and I'll bring up an infographic for it. It improves intrinsic attack damage while keeping overcharge going. I actually really like this one for this setup. And then you've got Legacy of the Bast. You can see the screenshot here. It applies an additional debuff to percussive blast attacks. Also help that it comes with Plasma Potentiator, which increases the amount of plasma damage dealt with any attack by 20%. For the build they're going for, one where you spam percussive blast, the slot 3 and 4 is actually really nice here. So this here then is a slot 1, so the claws of the Unconquered gear piece, you can see the image below, makes traversal intrinsic attacks do status damage of the melee gear equipped, so it's important to get this item with plasma on it. I don't have it with a third perk that improves intrinsic or traversal damage further, but that's what they're grinding for. I would recommend that if they're looking for a build that spams percussive blast, you want to get your intrinsic energy up as quick as you can, so you actually want to go for intrinsic energy regen on melee crit, and that would be perk number 2 there. That's ideally what you are looking for. So there's an awful lot going on here, so I'll actually just read the top paragraph, then I'll jump down to the TLDR. So the top paragraph gives us our slot number 2. This is the Gauntlets of the Unconquered. This particular one, you can see an infographic on screen. You can get an extra stack of the debuff you get with daggers now. It's an additional 3%. It's not a multiplier, it's only additive. This isn't worth going for at all. With the build that Alex is running, I would recommend that he goes for intrinsic regen on ranged crit. That way, if his health is low, he can actually hang back and he can build up his intrinsic energy to allow him to do percussive blast or to allow him to block attacks. Now, the next few paragraphs here, it's just really summing up the general theme of the build, which is a support debuff build, and I actually really like this, to be honest. So we'll skip past these paragraphs, we'll go down to the TLDR. The formatting of this is completely messed up. Where it says slot 1, which is the Battle Guard of the Ancestors, this is actually the slot 3, and this is one that I did like. Where it says slot 2, the Legacy of Bast, this is actually your heroic slot, so that's slot 4. This was another one that's nice and works great with the percussive blast build. Slot 3, Claws of the Unconquered, is actually your slot 1, and as mentioned, you're better going for intrinsic on melee crit for this particular slot. And then your slot 4 is actually slot 2. They made a complete mess of the formatting of this, but slot 4 is slot 2, and you're better going with some kind of buff on crit. So it could be a damage buff, intrinsic regen, or even heroic regen there. Major artifacts I actually really like. He's got some might there, maybe could do with some survivability as well, but I suppose you will be getting some survivability via the Cosmic Eye, so I actually really like that one. And then finishing up, you've got the Tacticon, so it gives you increased intrinsic attack status damage. Not using battery effect, so the buffing of your status damage isn't as important, and he mentions earlier on in the blog that it's not actually a DPS build either. So what I would actually go for would be the ring instead. That would allow him to spam his heroics, and you get some buffs and debuffs that are tied in with the heroics. So overall, how would I rate this build?
Pretty good.
So that build there was definitely an improvement on the first one we looked at. However, a build on Reddit which just shows a stat page would be an improvement on the first build we actually looked at. So it was a pretty low bar there. Now, the next build we'll look at will be from Brian Wagner. So this build here, I'm actually not going to spend too long on it. It looks very similar to Alex's build, so it's a percussive blast spam build, and really the suggestions that I gave Alex are actually being used here. You can see for the slot 1 you've got melee crit hits that are providing intrinsic burst. You've got the same on slot 2, and then the slot 3 you've got intrinsic burst as well. Personally, it's too much to have it across 3 slots. You don't need it as much as that. I would use the slot 3 that Alex was using earlier on, the same as the slot 4. It's the same one he's actually using there. So yeah, there's not a great deal we would change from my suggestions a moment ago, but let's see what's on the next page. So with this here, once again, it very much lines up with what I've mentioned before. In the TLDR section, the slot 3, once again, make sure you would use the slot 3 that Alex is actually using. The slot 4 matches up, and then your slot 1 and 2 are used to generate your intrinsic energy. Now the second paragraph here is pretty interesting. It's something I actually touched on for the ranged build, the first one we looked at. So it's saying, and this is a pro tip, this one, using King's Mercy when your intrinsic energy is full will apply a large amount of vibranium status on the enemy's hit. So when you've got full intrinsic energy, you use your assault heroic, you'll fully apply that vibranium status. That's why I was saying earlier on, what you would then do is you would use your daggers with an opposite status effect that has to be cold, and then you would get the battery effect there. So this is actually an interesting build. There's not a lot I can discuss about it, because I've kind of by and large discussed it earlier on in the video, but this was an interesting one.
Pretty good.
So as Meatloaf would say then, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Let's check out the next one. It's Scott Hitchcock. So the next build we'll look at here is a melee one. Now the build I done for Black Panther is actually a melee tank build. I'll put a link to that in the description below. But with this one here, it's talking about using a combo finisher that creates a large explosion, but the build doesn't really tie into making the most of that actual combo finisher. So we can see the slot 2 in this page here, which is your range one. Because they're using set gear, it's always going to roll precision, whereas you want might if you're going for a melee build. So I wouldn't use this item at all. What I would go for instead is a random legendary or rare that had might and also resolve on it if you are going to be a melee character and up close to enemies. On top of that as well, you want an opposite status effect from what you'll be using for your heavy combo finisher. It looks like Scott's actually using the same status effect for both, which means he doesn't get the battery effect. And then finally, it can be hard to get your heavy combo finishers off because as a melee character you keep getting staggered. So if you could, you'd probably look for a piece of gear that maybe had Jarvis barrier on it, because that will stop you getting staggered when you're doing your attacks. But that's the first page. Let's jump on to the next one. So the next 2 paragraphs we have here, it's all talking about using different status effects and combining range status effects and also the status effects on the end of your melee combo finishers. But as mentioned, you want to do opposite status effects. Yes, Cryo's really nice as a defensive character to slow people down, but with battery damage you're doubling your damage. So really, if you want to use cold at the end of your melee combo finisher, then you want to actually use warm on your range slot 2. You've then got an item shown here, Bashenga's Metal. We're going to talk about that a bit more in the next slide. So this page here has got another slot 4. The one we looked at a moment ago, Bashenga's Metal, is also a slot 4. So Scott's saying that you can use one of the 2 of these in regards to your slot 4 for a melee build. You want to use your Legacy of the Ancestors. Now that will buff the steroid boost you get from your ultimate heroic by 8.5 seconds. It can give you close to 100% uptime, and it's something I talk about a lot in my build video. But the reason that's so important, and Scott is missing a massive trick here, because he actually talks about survivability but he doesn't touch on this at all, is the buff that comes via your ultimate heroic actually allows you to block all attacks when you hold down the right trigger. So you can stand there next to an Adaptoid doing red attacks, doing dots, doing any attack, and you won't take any damage while this buff is up. So absolutely incredible, and unfortunately he completely omits it from the build. So once again, we've got the TLDR and a little bit more text. The top paragraph is actually more information on survivability that shows that it's really important for Scott's build, but as we mentioned a moment ago, he's missing one of the best elements of Black Panther, the steroid buff on his ultimate, allowing you to block every single attack, so he's definitely going to get marked down later on for missing that there, especially with the focus he has on survivability. But looking at the TLDR, for your slot 1, I wouldn't go for Azuri's Talons, I would go for a random Wakandan piece of gear that's got the damage buff on melee crit, that can only drop in Wakanda. For the slot 2, that can work, but you're losing might and resolve there, so I would rather go for a random legendary instead. You've then got your slot 3, this actually works really nice with the slot 4, they work great together, but again he's not made that link between the high up time on the ultimate buff and blocking all attacks. Your minor artifacts is a red, which works great because that's might. Yellow's Valor, no idea why he's actually using that because it's not a Valor based build. And then the major artifact unfortunately is Kimoyo Band. Scott, what have you done? You've definitely blown it at the end there. We've already discussed why Kimoyo Bands is so bad, and with the build that he's looking for, you want to run the ring so you can get high up time on the ultimate and the unblockable attacks. So how would we rate this particular one?
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
So overall then, that is a 50-50 split between good and bad builds there. One of them admittedly did come directly from a content creator, it was copied straight from them, so we're not really going to include that too much. So if we look at the 3 different builds, one of them was awful, one of them was middle of the road, and then the last one was actually pretty good. Now thankfully the last one that was good did come from the guy in charge of Loot at the moment, that is Alex. The really bad one, in case you're thinking I'm being a bit harsh on this, 1, I am a guide creator and I'm all about builds, that's what I do, I actually analyse builds. And 2, if you're going to put out a blog post and say you've got pro tips in it, and this blog post is coming out at a time when a lot of people will be looking for tips on how to build your hero, you want to put good builds out there, and that first one really was pretty awful. Now let me know what you think of the builds in the comments below, and let me know what you think of my analysis of them as well, and thanks for tuning in to this, stay safe and I'll see you all again soon.